While Place Vendôme is the headquarters of fine jewelry and fine watchmaking, there is an address that should not be forgotten, where we are in love with the pieces that made the history of precious watchmaking and that highlights an astonishing heritage and expertise: the Breguet Museum. Unlike any other, the Breguet House is a house full of history, so much so that it was necessary to gather in one location the parts that have made up its most beautiful past and give an opportunity to an informed public to discover them. Inaugurated in 2000 by Nicolas Hayek, the Breguet Museum unveils the creations of Abraham-Louis Breguet. Originally from Neufchâtel, the founder of the Breguet House arrived in Paris at the age of 15 to begin, on the eve of the French Revolution, his small watchmaking revolution.
Sa carrière débute à la fin de l'Ancien Régime, dans les années 1775.
His career began at the end of the Old Regime, in the years 1775 to 1780, so it's the time of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. The King and the Queen were both interested in watchmaking. Probably Marie Antoinette was more interested in the external aspect of watchmaking, while Louis XVI, who was a lover of mechanics and micromechanics, was interested in watchmaking technology. So it's not totally surprising that a very talented young watchmaker managed to make himself known to the court. The first orders from the court corresponds to the watches that Breguet calls perpetual, meaning they were self-winding watches. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette in 1782, 1786, and at other periods still acquired so-called perpetual watches. And then, I would say by the simple phenomenon of the court, the fact that the King and Queen were interested in this young watchmaker meant that this young watchmaker received orders from other members of the court, the brothers and the sisters of the King, and relatives like Axel de Fersen.
The greatest period of prosperity for Breguet was during the Restoration, between 1814 and 1830. At the Congress of Vienna in 1815, each plenipotentiary sitting around the negotiation table to settle the fate of the territories taken back from Napoleon was a client of Breguet and had his watch.
We have a huge heritage. The founder of the house is someone who revolutionized watchmaking, and it turns out that we have many testimonials of his work.
Testimonies that are now in the archives and works made by the watchmaker himself in very different fields of watchmaking, whose impact can be measured both technically and on the aesthetic and design plans of the watchmaker.
Il se distingue parce qu'il change l'aspect des montres.
He stands out because he changed the appearance of watches, and to change the appearance of watches, he had to change the technique. And his technical and aesthetic approach is a parallel approach. He stands out because he does totally new things. He does extremely elegant things, I would say in a new style. He introduces the neoclassical style into watchmaking. He moves completely away from Baroque in terms of the visual. And for the mechanical side, he is someone who invents. All his life, he invents new solutions, new ways of seeing the time, new ways to make watches chime, new ways to make a watch movement work. He continuously innovates.
Il innove continuellement.
Astonishing and amusing, these purchase entries that we discover in the archives, a wealth of information on his wealthy and refined clientele, from Napoleon Bonaparte to Alexander I, Tsar of Russia, and including the Duke of Wellington, a Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, and many generals and marshals of France stopped off at Breguet to erase the weariness of battle with their favorite timepiece.
Ce qui est derrière moi, ce sont les archives Breguet, donc c'est une partie essentielle du patrimoine.
What is behind me is the Breguet archives, so it's an essential part of the heritage of the house. Because to put it simply, it's the description of every object made by the house since the end of the 18th century. So number by number, object by object, everything is described. So we know the nature of the object, its characteristics. But what's extra is that we also know the date on which it was manufactured. We know the name of the customer, the sale price, etc., etc.
On connaît le nom du client, le prix de vente, etc., etc.
So much precious data making it possible to write the history of the Breguet house and describe the typology of the products or to describe the geographical history of its clients. For example, Breguet is the creator of the first wristwatch, which was an order from the Queen of Naples, the youngest sister of Napoleon I.
L'histoire de la première montre bracelet.
The story of the first wristwatch is typically something that was discovered by flipping through these archives. We discovered that in 1810, Caroline Murat, who was already an excellent client of Breguet and who became a greater client thereafter, as long as her reign lasts in Naples, orders a watch made to be placed on the forearm. And this is the story of the first watch that was designed, since the beginning, with a special shape to be placed on the forearm. And this form has an oblong shape.
Inventiveness and innovation remain the main characteristics of the founder of Breguet over time. He has approached all areas of watchmaking, from the simplest watch for the great Italian composer Rossini, or the most complicated ones like this medallion version as seen here that belonged to Empress Marie-Louise.
Vous avez dans ce musée beaucoup de pièces qui sont des pièces majeures.
You have in this museum many pieces that are major pieces, not only the works of Breguet, but the history of watchmaking. You have tourbillons, which is a major invention of Breguet. It's very famous and is still made today by us, but also by many other houses. We have a very beautiful touch-reading watch, which is something special also, on a mechanical level, and which is a historical watch, since it is the watch of the Empress Josephine. We also have the first split-seconds chronograph. We have marine chronometers, which are an important part of Breguet's work, since he was named Watchmaker of the Navy, which was a huge honor and a very big responsibility. So it's the time of the Restoration, after the Revolution, and even after the Napoleonic period.
Among the creations that have revolutionized the world of watchmaking, the tourbillon and its patent.
C'était quelque chose de très important dans le contexte de l'époque, où précisément il pouvait y avoir une usure particulière due à la position verticale des montres.
It was something very important in the context of the time, where precisely there could be a particular wear due to the vertical position of the watches, and this utility at the time is absolutely not disputed. Breguet's patent is very relevant, since actually, by turning it, all that is contained in the vortex cage rotates uniformly, with evenly distributed wear. And today, what we continue to do in terms of contemporary tourbillons is a tribute to the work of Breguet.
Bien évidemment, on est très au-delà de la fonction utilitaire. Aujourd'hui, la haute horlogerie n'est plus du tout dans une perspective utilitaire, c'est simplement un hommage à Breguet.
Discretion requires that this house, which has worked for kings, never reveals the names of its prestigious contemporary clients, a rule that does not do any harm. But Breguet is full of anecdotes about its past clients who made history.
What is fascinating is to see the extent of the network and the reputation of Breguet in all the countries of the world, almost at the same time as Napoleon and his brothers, sisters, brothers-in-law and sisters-in-law. They all wore Breguets, even their worst enemies. The King of England in particular, the Prince Regent, the future George IV, and then the Tsar of Russia were also fanatics of Breguet watches.
It was of course impossible for the Breguet House to deliver two identical watches to sworn enemies. Against all odds, for the simple reason that the watchmaker never reproduced the same piece twice. Each of the 5,000 works by Abraham-Louis himself, with the collaboration of his son and members of his studio, were different. Quite the challenge. There were as many timepieces as there were kings that bought them for themselves, but they also bought simpler versions to offer as gifts. Between an impressive international network and exports complicated by a tense political context, as a prestige clockmaker, Abraham-Louis Breguet was able to face his challenges with an iron will, thanks to which he has been etched into the collective memory. The proof of this is the literature of the time, with Stendhal and his travelogue of 1817, traveling Rome, Naples and Florence. But also Balzac, Victor Hugo, Mérimée, Pushkin or Alexandre Dumas, whose watch worn by one of the characters of the Count of Monte Cristo, Danglars, is a Breguet.
La présence de Breguet dans la littérature, c'est quelque chose de très particulier.
The presence of Breguet in literature is something very particular, because it is very developed. One could find other occasional cases for other houses perhaps, but not in the same proportion as for Breguet, because really, it's a panorama of literature, again, not only French, but also English literature, Russian literature, where Breguet is abundantly quoted. These writers were not strictly speaking clients, because writers are not necessarily very rich people, but the fact that they quoted Breguet is simply to describe a milieu, to describe a universe. They needed to place objects, facilitating the identification of the environment, or the description of the environment. And when they wanted to describe a refined watch, a watch of great prestige, well, the name that came to them was the name of Breguet.
Despite his successes and international prestige, Abraham-Louis Breguet remained a humble and modest man all his life.
For me, what touches me is the artistic side. It is the fact that each of his dials were different, and that always harmonious. I think that it's someone who had an interior life and something harmonious in him, because that is what shows in his work.
And even today, as in the past, it is his watch that travels through time, just as it marks it, and remains the best ambassador of the House of Breguet.